Which is better, the Samsung Galaxy A04 or the Samsung Galaxy A03? Well, in this video, we're gonna find out. What's going on, everyone? This is Kevin here, coming at you with my comparison of the A04 versus the A03. Now, as the names of these two phones do imply, the A04 is the successor to the A03. So going from one generation to the next, it's really more of an evolution rather than a complete redesign, but I think this video will be very interesting, showing the various similarities and differences between these two phones. Now, the first thing I want to discuss are the displays of these two devices. Now, they're actually the same exact size at 6.5 inches. You can see when holding the two phones up side by side, the devices are also the same size as well. So you pretty much have the same size bezels here, which are pretty small, with slightly thicker bottom bezels, and then up top here they do have water drop notches. Now, both phones do feature PLS IPS LCD displays, and both displays are 720p. Now, for lower end devices such as these, it's not much of a surprise that they are 720p. I will say I do prefer 1080p, that's for sure, but you can see when looking kind of closely at the displays, they do still look pretty crisp and clear. And overall, considering that these two phones are very low-end devices, the actual look of the display, like the color accuracy and everything like that, is quite good. So at first glance, you wouldn't even know that these two phones are actually very cheap. Now, in addition to that, both phones feature a PPI of 270, they both have a 20:9 aspect ratio, and then the screen to body ratio is slightly different, but they're both around 81%. Now, up top here in the water drop notches, both phones do have 5 megapixel front facing cameras, and check out the reviews that I've done for both of these phones to see a variety of different photo and video samples from both of them. Now, both of these devices also feature 64 gigabytes of storage, along with micro SD card expansion. Now, even though that is a lot of storage, I do still feel like 64 gigs in 2023 kind of is the bare minimum, because if you have any less than that, you're not going to have a whole lot of extra free space, because the system software will then take up the majority of the storage. But then also having the ability to add in a micro SD card is definitely very useful and pretty important, especially in this situation, because you can always offload photos and videos, for example, onto that SD card to free up some internal space. Now, neither of these two phones have wireless charging, and they also both don't have fingerprint sensors. However, the two devices do feature face unlock, so I do appreciate that we at least have that. Now, taking a look at the camera modules on the back of the two phones, there are some similarities and there's also some differences. So they're similar in the sense that there's a dual camera setup on both phones, and then they also both have 2 megapixel depth sensing cameras, but then for the main cameras, we're getting 50 megapixels with the A04 versus 48 megapixels with the A03. And then you can also see the overall appearance of the camera modules is slightly different, as we kind of have this back plate behind the actual cameras themselves. Whereas with the A04, there's really nothing distinguishing the camera module besides the actual cameras themselves. Now, taking a look at the camera apps on both phones, this is how things look. This is with the main rear camera on both devices. Now, keep in mind that for the A04, it doesn't actually capture images at the full 50 megapixels by default. Instead, you have to go up top here and then go to 50 megapixel 3x4 mode to actually get that. And then with the A03, you can also go up here and then access the 48 megapixel camera that way. So even though these cameras are 50 megapixels and 48 megapixels, by default, it actually captures images at a lower megapixel count to save up space. But I'm gonna take a picture of this plant with both phones, and we'll kind of compare things side by side here. There we go, and we'll pull these up. And now that I've them pulled up, you can see zooming in, I would say the A04 definitely does have better camera quality compared to the A03. So that's pretty interesting. You can see, especially when kind of zooming in here, things are a lot brighter and clearer with the A04, and you can see further into the plant itself. Now, in addition to that, we're also getting portrait mode on both phones, and then also flipping around to the front-facing cameras, I'll take a selfie with both. So there's me right there, starting off with the A03, and then now the A04, and then I'll pull up these images. There we go. So also in this situation, it does seem like the A04 is a lot better. So a much better selfie camera on the A04. And with both phones, we do have a group selfie option, so it does crop things out a little bit. And then you can take standard selfies with both phones as well. And then also, both of these phones are capable of capturing 1080p video with both the front and rear cameras. so that's pretty good. Now, as far as RAM and processors go, with the A04, we're getting 4 gigabytes of RAM versus either 3 or 4 gigabytes of RAM with the A03 based on which version of the phone you end up buying. Now, this particular model of the A03 does have 4 gigabytes of RAM, so both phones have the same amount of RAM in this situation. Now, the processors are very different from one device to another. With the Galaxy A04, we have the MediaTek Helio P35 processor compared to the Unisoc UMS9230 with the A03. Now, from my experience of using both phones, I do feel like in some ways the A03 is actually faster and runs a bit better. However, when it comes to image processing and things like that, which the processor does actually play a role in that quality, the A04 does a better job. But I did run a benchmark test with both devices, and the scores that I got from that test are actually pretty interesting. So with the Galaxy A04, you can see the benchmark scores are significantly lower compared to the A03. Now in reality, I don't really feel like the A04 is that much slower than the A03. It's not like it has half the amount of speed or anything like that. So I was pretty surprised to see the big difference in scores here. But regardless, I do feel like we did kind of get a performance downgrade going from the A03 to the A04, which is a bit unfortunate. And then with both phones, we are getting very large 5,000 milliamp hour internal batteries. And then neither of these two phones have NFC, which is pretty disappointing. Now, taking a look at the ports on the bottom of the two phones, this is a pretty big difference, and this might be a reason to go for the A04 over the A03, and that is that with the A04, we do have a USB-C port for charging and data transfer compared to a micro USB port here with the A03. So I'm glad that from one generation to the next, we have yet another line of phones that has ditched micro USB. I'm definitely not a big fan of micro USB for many reasons, so I'm glad that's not there with the A04. But if I had to use the A03 and deal with a micro USB charger, I would find that to be a bit frustrating, that's for sure. But taking a look at the actual builds of the two phones themselves, I already talked quite a bit about the front panels here, but taking a look at the back of the two phones, there's some pretty major differences in the sense of the materials. Now, they are both made of plastic, and I really like this bold red color that we're getting with the A03, but you can see that we go from kind of this interesting texture on the A03 with it being a matte finish to this glossy finish with the A04. I'm definitely not a fan of this finish on the A04 because it picks up a ton of fingerprints, so I actually think the A03 looks nicer. But taking a look at the left side of both phones, we have the slot for the micro SD card and SIM card. Then on the right side, both phones have volume up, volume down, and the power button. Then up top here, both phones have the noise canceling microphones. And then on the bottom here, we have the 3.5mm headphone jacks, microphone, USB-C port for the A04, and micro USB port for the A03. And then both phones do have their speakers on the bottom here. Then taking a look at the back of the two devices, I already talked about the difference in materials, but we have the Samsung logo and cameras and flash. But in conclusion, I honestly would avoid both of these phones. So I know that's not really what you're going to hear in this video, but I think both are pretty underpowered in general, and then not having a fingerprint sensor in either of the two phones can get pretty frustrating, that's for sure. So I wish we had that feature. I wish that the phones were a bit faster. I wish we had a little bit better cameras, or at least more camera features. So I suppose if you want a phone that kind of does the bare minimum, these two are definitely capable of achieving that. That's for sure. But at the same time, I feel like with all the various options out there, you can probably get something better for pretty much the same price. Also, maybe even consider going for a higher end phone that's used, because phones definitely go down in value pretty quickly, especially if there's already been a previous owner. But at the same time, if you go for a used device that's technically better than these, you probably will still have a better experience, even though it's not brand new, as these phones would be for you. But hopefully this video gave you a little bit better of an idea of if you should go for the A03 or A04, or if you should avoid both of them. But most importantly, let me know what you think in the comment section below. But this is Kevin here, coming at you with my comparison of the Samsung Galaxy A04 versus the Samsung Galaxy A03. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video.